Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are picking back up again with DCeased, with Dead Planet number 2. And this one actually gives us a group called Shadowpatch, but we'll talk about that here in a little bit. What it really does is it opens up with Arsenal, Red Arrow, whatever you want to call him, but it opens up with Roy Harper. And the cool thing about this is it kind of gives us this little bit of an indication of the fact that things are still kind of continuing on, right? Because one of the things to understand, for those of you guys who didn't see the first video, and you'll find the full DCeased playlist down in the description, but for those of you guys who didn't see the first video, that what you had here was basically just 5 years that have passed since the initial outbreak of the virus, right? That's where Dead Planet picks up. The main DCeased event happens, the virus breaks out, it's everybody kind of panicking, basically the superheroes vacating Earth, and then 5 years later, Dead Planet takes place. And so for the last 5 years, Roy Harper's basically been on Earth trying to hold off these monsters, essentially, you know, these more or less undead people. Now, one of the cool things to also realize here is that Roy Harper's one of many heroes who did that, right? That the whole situation escalated so astronomically fast, right? We're talking about within the span of a day. The whole situation escalated so fast that there wasn't really enough time to get everybody off Earth, right? It was basically the superheroes like Superman and Martian Manhunter and Barry Allen and those guys doing what they could where they could, but as we saw, they all basically fell. You know, over the span of a day or two, they were trying to get as many normal humans off planet as they possibly could, and the expectation is that they would come back and they would grab everybody else as soon as they could, but the result is that didn't happen, right? So Roy Harper's just been kind of making it, and when you're thinking about it that way, it's actually kind of sad, right? That Roy Harper is one of a multitude of heroes who were just sort of left behind in the initial outbreak of all of this. Now, the other part of that is, of course, you have all these various, you know, kids and so on, these adults and people who are being protected by Roy Harper. But the issue is that as soon as we kind of get this glimpse of the fact that he's here, he's immediately incinerated, right? He's completely and totally destroyed. And that leads to the arrival of John Constantine and Shadowpatch. Now, Shadowpatch is a group that's actually been around for a long time in DC Comics, right? They're not new to the DCeased landscape. Shadowpatch first appeared in DC Comics in Days of Vengeance #1 back in 2005, right? So they've been around for about 15 years or so. Now, the original roster, as far as I'm aware of, consisted of Enchantress, Ragman, Detective Chimp, Blue Devil, Nightshade, and Nightmaster. And then I think it also had Constantine. But the idea behind that was basically like a supernatural team. DC, for the most part, had their whole supernatural element, and it didn't really cross over a lot with the main superheroes. That's what made John Constantine so intriguing, is because for a lot of fans, John Constantine crossed over with people like that all the time, right? With Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman, those various characters. Enchantress did, as you know, to a degree, but Detective Chimp, Blue Devil, you never really saw those kind of characters cross over with DC a whole lot. I will say with Blue Devil, it was a little bit different because he originally appeared in the Firestorm comics, so to a degree he did. But it's one of these cool situations because it's basically like a supernatural superhero team. But for the most part, Shadowpatch gets in there and immediately goes to work. Now, one of the things that I want you guys to notice here is that unlike the main DCeased event where they came across all these various humans and the idea was to save the individuals they could, that's changed, right? We saw that change during Hope at World's End, and we even saw it change towards the latter end of the DCeased event, right? That the various superheroes were kind of looking at that and saying, okay, there's nothing we can do to save these guys, right? They're gone now, right? They're basically broken. Now, we as the reader knew they could be saved. We knew that by virtue of Cyborg and the fact that there was actually a cure, right? We've known that for a little while. But for the most part, when you have Shadowpatch facing off against, you know, these normal humans, it's what you would expect, right? I mean, these are normal, regular, average Joes, right? Soccer moms, hockey dads, not a whole lot going on there. But then suddenly Swamp Thing appears. Now, Swamp Thing is kind of like the unsung hero of DCeased, if I'm being honest with you guys, because what DC did here, and I feel like this is really just sort of a hurrah for Swamp Thing fans, is this guy is a total force to be reckoned with. Like, and he always seems to show up at the most inopportune times, right? Like, they're in the middle of a great big huge fight, and then he pops up and tells Constantine he needs to talk about a garden. It's like, okay, look, man, that's cool and everything. Don't care about your radishes. We got a great big huge conflict going on here. We need to cope with this, right? We need to deal with this. I'm sure the radishes will be fine, right? Like, but that's not really what's happening here. But when Constantine says, like, we have this great big huge thing, I don't really have time for this, Swamp Thing summons the green and then takes all the humans out like that. That's what makes Swamp Thing so cool, is because aside from like super powered individuals that have the ability to overcome his powers, no one else is really going to stand against him, right? So at any given time, and seemingly if he chose to, Swamp Thing could probably eradicate every single infected human on Earth within a day or two. But of course, once all these humans here are dealt with, then Swamp Thing starts talking to Constantine. And what he says is that yes, there's a garden in Gotham City that was created by Poison Ivy as a safe haven, but there's also one in Australia, and that the garden itself is screaming out. Now, Constantine almost kind of like begins to blow off, blow off Swamp Thing, and Swamp Thing just freaks out and cusses at him. which is something that you never see. And everybody's just kind of like, damn, man, did Swamp Thing really just do that? And Constantine's like, yeah, man, he did. You know, I kind of got him to that point, so I'm a little bit proud of it. You know, I'm kind of glad that I got him to that place, which is kind of cool, to be honest. But basically, Swamp Thing kind of reveals that this garden needs to be looked at. Like, whatever is going on here, Swamp Thing cannot get inside. He cannot access it himself. And so they need to respond. They need to find out what's happening here, right? So jump forward to the garden in Gotham City, which has grown by a huge margin since it was originally created. Now, again, this is Poison Ivy's doing, right? Where Swamp Thing has the ability to tap into the green, which is to say nature itself, right? Trees, bushes, all that kind of stuff. Poison Ivy can basically do the same thing. For the longest time, that was never the case. For the longest time, she was just a chick that loved plants. It wasn't until more recently in DC Comics, relatively speaking to the time the publisher's been around, that Poison Ivy was kind of tied into the green, that she was basically an elemental and she was able to manipulate the green in the same way Swamp Thing does. But one of the things that's kind of given to us here, sort of solidified, is that it's not enough to have this garden that's kind of ever, you know, constantly shifting, constantly changing, so that none of the undead can access it, just to make sure there are no weak points, right? That's one of the smart things here, is that if this garden was static, which is to say it didn't change, it was just this giant erected wall of like greenery and whatnot, then as the undead kept flinging themselves against it, it would create weak structural points, and that would inevitably lead to one of these points breaking and then the undead flooding in. But the fact that it's changing and shifting all the time means there are no weak points. But it wasn't enough for the various walls themselves, because there were also various superhuman beings out there, right, who could penetrate these walls, destroy them. And so the green walls themselves were actually fortified through the magic of Dr. Fate, right, the Tower of Fate, which basically provides a kind of level of magical protection against whatever forces may be out there. Now, it's not all encompassing, right? It's not an indestructible force field, right? We know that there are weaknesses there, and a being of sufficient power can overtake it. But what you end up having here is, of course, kind of this detection system that more or less comes with this wall that lets Poison Ivy and the various individuals know that somebody's coming. And of course, this leads to Mary Marvel, you know, using the power of Shazam to become, you know, Mary Marvel, the Shazam person, right? Her name's actually Mary Marvel. She doesn't get a name like Shazam. With Dr. Fate donning his helmet, and then of course Mary Marvel kind of going out there, they immediately meet Cassie Sandsmark, right? Now, Cassie Sandsmark is a character who has been Wonder Woman on a multitude of instances over the course of DC Comics. And in reality, once she popped up and once she developed her fan base, which is a hardcore fan base, here's the thing, guys, there are some characters in comics where fans won't hear a word against them. And Cassie Sandsmark fans love Cassie Sandsmark. If you walk up to one of the Cassie Sandsmark fans and you're like, hey, so this character is basically just a poor man's Wonder Woman, they'll get pissed. They'll freak, right? They'll absolutely lose their minds. No, that's not true at all. She's better Wonder Woman than Diana Prince was, you know, and pulling out all these arguments and all that kind of stuff. It's honestly, I've watched it happen. It's kind of funny, right? Like, funny story, we were at New York Comic Con one year, and myself and Benny and Sal and all of us were hanging out, and we were hanging out with fans, we were talking to fans, different things like that, and one of the fans kind of made this offhanded comment of how, like, Cassie Sandsmark was not that interesting of a Wonder Woman. These two fans ended up, like, not really arguing and, like, fighting, but, like, debating with each other for something like 35 minutes, going back and forth over whether or not Cassie Sandsmark was actually a good Wonder Woman. Cassie Sandsmark fans hate it when people talk trash about her, but she's here basically with Jonathan Kent. Now, if you guys recall from the first video that we did, Jonathan Kent had basically, like where Wonder Woman was kind of going awry, Jonathan Kent had tried to stop Wonder Woman from being killed, and that led to him being impaled with the sword alongside Wonder Woman, right? And what that meant was when the sword was pulled out of Wonder Woman through Jonathan Kent, her blood would have infected him, and that would have led to him being infected with the anti-life virus. And that's exactly what happened. And it's kind of good that DC paid attention to that, right? It's one of the things a lot of you guys actually noticed too, because I was looking through the comments, and like one of the first things you guys were saying was, as soon as that sword gets pulled out, Jonathan's going to be infected, right? It's like the number one thing you guys were saying. I thought it was cool, right? Because it didn't even occur to me at the time when I was reading that. Like, I didn't even think about that, right? So it's awesome that you guys caught that. But yeah, so once they grab him and once they bring him in, or at least with the intention of bringing him in, there's a great big huge argument that kind of breaks out between Black Canary, Green Lantern, and with like Poison Ivy over whether or not Jonathan should be allowed in here. And the response of Poison Ivy is no, we're not going to let Jonathan in here. This place is literally a safe haven, a refuge from those individuals who are infected by the anti-life virus. We're not going to let some guy in here just so we can run into all this craziness and have to basically flee this entire thing, right? This place is held against the undead for 5 years. We're not going to put that at risk. And so where you have, Green Lantern, he's like, well, I mean, if he leaves, I leave, then the response of Poison Ivy is then leave. We're not going to let him in here. And the reality is they kind of have to abide by that, right? If anything, it's more of just kind of like an honor code. A man doesn't walk into another man's house and start telling him what's what. That's just, it doesn't work that way. And Green Lantern cannot walk into this protected citadel of Poison Ivy and then start kind of calling the shots and pretending to be the boss, all that kind of stuff, because Poison Ivy will kick her out. And so she ends up grabbing Jonathan Kent, and they end up bailing out. And so from there, you pick up inside of the green in Australia, right out in the outback, and you've got, you know, kind of a whole army of undead who are just surrounding what's basically called this blood moat, right? Just this gigantic moat, and you've got this great big huge building, right? You know, this huge citadel of sorts. Now, when they arrive there, you end up having Shadowpatch who's kind of like, okay, so like we need the power of Zatanna, we need, you know, these individuals, and what we need is to find a way to basically fly over the blood moat, and then once we get to the other side, then we can figure out what's going on with the citadel, and we can figure out what's going on with the green. Simple enough. The problem with this, as Detective Chimp figures it out, once he's sort of looking in there, the problem with this is that it's not blood. And when they're like, what in the heck is it? Then suddenly we find out it's Plastic Man, right? This whole huge moat is Plastic Man. Now, here's the important thing to understand, guys. Plastic Man is probably the most powerful being in the entirety of DC Comics, at least in terms of Earth-based superheroes, right? He's not more powerful than the Spectre or anybody like that, but in terms of the Earth-based superheroes, he's more powerful than almost anybody else. He can shapeshift, he can become anybody, right? So unless you're somebody with telepathic abilities like Martian Manhunter, you won't know who he is, and I believe that he can actually block Martian Manhunter's telepathy, right? So Martian Manhunter can't read his mind. If he decided to face off against somebody like Superman, he wouldn't have to punch him. He could just use his immalleability and then just fill the lungs of Superman with himself and then suffocate him. There's almost no real means to overcome Plastic Man outside of like freezing him or something along those lines. And that's exactly what happens here, right? Plastic Man tears through the entirety of Shadowpatch. Ragman, dead. Zatanna, dead. Blue Devil, dead. Like every single one of these guys is completely and totally destroyed by Plastic Man, save for John Constantine and Detective Chimp and Swamp Thing, who are just falling endlessly into the gaping maw of this massively mutated and twisted version of Plastic Man towards their grisly deaths. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. Now we'll catch you all later. Peace. Wow.